Leo? Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started. Hope the room change isn't too confusing. Sorry about that. Someone took our room. So the Office of Admissions, actually they used to own that room before we started to use it, and this is kind of their time when they need it for spring admissions, so we've lost the room. So it's kind of confusing today, and next Friday we'll be moving around a lot. This afternoon we'll be in room 306, and of course we're doubling up Friday morning, Friday afternoon in order to finish all of these seminars in time. And kind of the dry stuff we put in the mornings, the coherence and cohesion are in the mornings. This afternoon I'll be talking more about the process of writing papers, some considerations for writing good papers in your particular field, what writing is like in your field, why that is, how the nature of the research that you do influences the writing. And it's not in the notes, but I'm also going to talk about the process of submitting papers and getting published in journals, partly from my own experience. Today we're talking about coherence. And next Friday morning we'll talk about cohesion, and these are kind of similar, they overlap somewhat. These are kind of linguistic terms. So coherence has to do with the flow of ideas, the flow of phrases and clauses and sentences. So it's not the flow of ideas. Cohesion is more about the flow of words and wording, and includes so coherence has to do with how well you see the flow of ideas. How does this idea connect with the idea before? How does this sentence connect with the sentence before? Cohesion is more about the connection between words. If you see a word and the writer puts "the" on it, was it mentioned before, or do you understand from context what it's referring to? Do you understand how these words are connected? So word flow and word choice. So cohesion, and also word choice, related word choice issues we'll talk about next Friday morning, including Konglish problems with wording. As a linguist, I've studied those and I find them interesting. And then next Friday afternoon next week, I'll talk about paraphrasing and using sources, avoiding plagiarism, using source citations, using sources wisely to make your points, to make your arguments, citation systems, like the way you cite papers, and this varies from one field to another. You've got the APA and the MLA style, the Chicago style. The way you cite your sources and put them in your paper, it's really different between the hard sciences and, say, the humanities and social sciences. And they're different systems, and there are reasons for that, the reasons why those systems are different. We'll talk about that. So, starting with coherence, today's topic, the word flow. I want you to look at your handout. Under 1.1, we'll talk about these are examples of sentences with either main clauses versus subordinate clauses. So 1.1, I want you to look at these pairs of sentences, like 1A, 1B. Might be a typo. So take a look at these for a minute, maybe talk with your neighbor. What's the difference between the A version and the B version under 1.1 here in the middle of page 1? So if you have the handout, well, I don't think we provided handouts this time, but you can maybe look with a neighbor. Some of your neighbors have hard copies or tablets. I need to get my own tablet someday. Those are really nice. So look on with a neighbor on a hard copy or tablet. So what's the difference between the two types of sentences, the two versions of the sentences? Okay, so have you had time to look at these? Do you need more time? Okay. So, for those of you who just come in, we're talking about the difference between sentences with main clauses, talking about main clauses or independent clauses versus subordinate or dependent clauses. Now, you've probably had a lot of English grammar pounded into your heads by the way you've been taught before. You've had to learn a lot of rules, but they probably haven't taught you really what's important, which is why we use these things and what they do for coherence or flow, the real function of these things. So, the A versions and the B versions, for example, what differences, which ones do you think are better? Which are better? The A versions or the B versions, which sound better? For academic writing anyway. The B versions? Okay, why do the B versions sound better?
The structure is more smooth and you get the meaning,
okay.
You understand the meaning more quickly.
Okay, you get the meaning more quickly, and there's a reason for that. And there's a reason it seems to flow smoother. Do you all agree the B versions seem smoother? They flow better, and there's a reason for that. In the past, they may have just taught you memorize these types of subordinating conjunctions, but they don't really explain why or how you use them. As you read academic papers after today, you can understand why they're using these and how these work. So good academic writing, it stands to dealing with complex ideas, and often it flows better when you use complex sentences that have subordinate or dependent clauses. There's a reason for that. And if you want to guess how that is, like psychologically, why does it feel better when you have, why does it flow better? Why do you have better coherence and flow? How is it you get the idea better? Well, let's say you just string together two of these things. You have a main clause sentence, and then maybe a full stop, a period, and then a separate sentence with the next idea in a main clause. So you could have two separate sentences with main clauses. Or maybe you put them together into a compound sentence with maybe an and or a but or so. So a compound sentence with two main clauses. And you notice that doesn't, in these examples anyway, it doesn't flow as nicely as a complex sentence where you have a subordinate clause connected to a main clause. And it could be main clause, subordinate clause, it could be subordinate clause, main clause. It seems to flow better in these cases. Well, the reason is when your brain is reading, your brain spends more time to process the information in a main clause. And your brain spends a little less time, it reads through this subordinate clause a little more quickly. And so good writers make use of this fact in the way they string together subordinate clauses and complex sentences. The more important information is probably going to be in a main clause. Secondary information is going to be in a subordinate clause. Therefore, your brain goes through this a little more quickly to get to the main idea. And that's why in a complex sentence with a subordinate clause, you get the main idea more easily and more quickly because you're highlighting the more important information with a main clause. And some linguists call this foregrounding and backgrounding. So the main clause foregrounds the most important information, and maybe information that's secondary or not the most important thing is kind of backgrounded. It's kind of like if you're paying attention to me right now, I'm occupying the foreground of your attention. You're spending more of your mental resources, your attentional resources here in the front part of your brain to focus on me and listen to me. I'm occupying the foreground of your attention. The background is stuff you pay less attention to. You probably don't pay as much attention to the floor, the whiteboard, unless I'm pointing to it, the ceiling, you know, that podium and that clock and the door and such. You don't pay attention to the door unless the lecture is really boring and you want to get over there and get out. And so with sentences, it's kind of similar. A main clause draws more mental attention, more mental focus, more mental processing. A subordinate clause, your brain goes through a little more quickly, it gets less attention mentally. And so that's why the B versions of these sentences seem to flow better. The B versions have maybe secondary information that either leads to and supports the main clause or provides maybe explanation, further explanation for the main idea in the main clause. So you could have a main clause, for example, that presents your main idea, followed by a subordinate clause that maybe gives some explanation or an example or a contrast, like with although or such. Or you can have a subordinate clause that provides secondary information like an example or explanation or a contrast that leads up to the main point in the main clause. And they probably never taught you this, right? This is how good writers mix and use complex sentence types. And so in academic writing, we use a lot of complex sentences because there's a lot of complex ideas, and you want readers to understand what's the main point of the sentence and what information is secondary. And so two main clauses, like in the A versions, you're kind of giving equal attention, and it doesn't flow smoothly. It doesn't really highlight what's more important. It sounds kind of more like duh, duh, like that. It's not as smooth as opposed to a da, da, you know, musically. Thinking music or beats or such. Da, da, or da, da. It's better. And you don't want to listen to music that's always da, 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 unless you like hardcore punk or such sometimes. But even that gets tiring after a while. So so if you pay attention to academic writing in your field, you notice the good writers, the people who express their ideas well, will use complex sentence types and different types of sentences to put more or less attention on more important ideas or less important ideas. The good writers. There are bad writers who get published. People who are not so skilled. If you look at the good writers, read the good writers in your field and how they use different types of sentences, shorter sentences, longer sentences, sometimes with two main clauses, but more often complex sentences with main and subordinate clauses. Now let's look at, there's some other kinds of backgrounding devices. I'm going to go on to page 2. And again, some of this will become relevant also when we talk about paraphrasing. I'll talk about paraphrasing a little bit this morning because some of these backgrounding devices we use when we paraphrase information from sources. And this ties into next Friday afternoon's talk on using sources. I'll kind of review some of that again next Friday and then talk about other aspects of using sources. But when you're paraphrasing or summarizing information, you're getting information from sources, you're doing your literature review, you have to paraphrase that information. And it's important to focus on what's more important on that information you're citing and what's less important. And so, for example, a prepositional phrase, like here in 1.2a, here we have a long prepositional phrase, which is summarizing less important information, and then the main clause, students are randomly assigned blah, 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 and that's more important. And this is summarizing a previous study, what somebody did in a previous study. Same thing with B, participle phrases, you know, finding past motivation studies, blah, blah, blah. That's secondary, and it's secondary to the main clause. Smith and Jones use blah, blah, blah. Infinitive and gerund phrases, okay, subordinate clauses, although and since. Okay, although is the equivalent of but, and I'll talk about those again in a few minutes. Then you've got because and since. So sometimes you have, for example, you have so, which is kind of like cause and effect or result, and then you've got a subordinate version like since or because. And since actually background something even more than because. So because backgrounds kind of the reason somewhat, and since kind of backgrounds that reason even more than because. A stronger backgrounding effect with since. Maybe it's information that's even more secondary or maybe more familiar to the reader, and you can use since. Some other examples, you've got but, and then you've got although, and so on. So there are a number of pairs. So sometimes you've got a choice of these coordinating conjunctions that connect two main clauses. Sometimes you can use these subordinate conjunctions instead for a different kind of flow. So section 2 it talks more specifically about paraphrasing techniques or summarizing techniques. And some other considerations, some other things I've noticed with either new writers, people who are new to academic writing, whether they're native speakers of English or whether they are Koreans or Chinese. These are problems that are common to all new writers, people who are not accustomed to academic writing. You've got to do maybe a literature review. You look at the past literature, the past research. You've got to talk about their key findings, or their key ideas, and that serves as a basis or rationale for the research that you're writing about, your ideas. I noticed that a lot of writers sometimes over-summarize. They put in too much information, unnecessary details. If it's like experimental studies, they may spend a lot of time talking about stuff that's not really important. Like many times it's not important to talk about how somebody else designed their study, how many subjects they had, what was their theoretical motivation. Maybe you don't need to spend much time talking about that, unless maybe for some reason you really need to critique their research methods, or you want to take issue with their theoretical motivation or their hypothesis. But oftentimes it's maybe not necessary to do that. The statistical results. Oftentimes it may not be necessary, usually, to summarize the stats results from someone else's studies, whether their p-values, their t-values. I mean, usually that's not important. What's important is the main findings. What was the main finding? The experimental design you can maybe summarize in a few words, at most, and report the key findings and implications. Maybe sometimes their motivation or their rationale. But a lot of this stuff you can leave out. So I find that students often summarize too much information. So when you're summarizing ideas from someone else's paper, or their research results, or their theories, or their models, or such, you've got to paraphrase or summarize. So how do you go about summarizing or paraphrasing? What do you change? What do you start with? What do you change first? You need to paraphrase somebody else's ideas, someone's past study, someone's past scholarly ideas in your paper. What do you do? How do you start? What do you start with first?
First of all, I think we should find key sentence.
Yes.
And then, or keywords.
Mm-hmm.
Make them.
Okay, keywords, okay. So key sentences, and maybe what's a paragraph in their study, like in their results section, you can maybe summarize down to one sentence or two sentences perhaps, and a few words that just in passing describe their study design and such. What words do you change first? Can you change keywords? Probably not. Probably those words you can't change. Technical words, probably not. Like if they do a factor analysis study, you can't change factor analysis. You can't, if they do a principal component analysis, you can't say, oh, they did a factor analysis. You can't change that. Because those are two different things. And if you change that, a statistician will probably get mad at you. So technical terms you can't change. But other words you can change. So if it's not a technical term, maybe things like what we call content words. Other content words maybe you can change. And those are other important words other than technical terms, things like nouns, main verbs, and adjectives mainly. Maybe adverbs too, but usually adverbs you leave out. So you might change keywords like those, content words like nouns, verbs, adjectives. You might change sentences. You might combine sentences together. So for example, 2.3, serial verb phrases. This is one way of condensing maybe a whole paragraph into one sentence, 2.3. So here in this example, they observed English classes, and that phrase maybe summarizes several sentences in the original study, simply, succinctly, concisely describing their research method. They observed English classes, coded the teacher-student behavior, and administered questionnaires. So you got observed, blah, 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 coded, blah, 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 administered, blah, blah, blah. So each of these verb phrases is condensing maybe a whole paragraph in the original study. And you've condensed it to a series of verb phrases: observed, blah, 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 coded, blah, 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 administered, blah, blah, blah. So you've got 3 paragraphs compressed into one sentence. Or, likewise with the passive, English teachers were recruited, blah, 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 were observed, blah, 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 were administered. With the passive, you can use passive voice, which emphasizes what happened to the grammatical subject to the sentences. Also reporting verbs, or communication verbs. And these are verbs for reporting what somebody did. Like somebody suggested, this researcher reported, observed that. And I see some errors that Koreans make with some of these reporting verbs. And I've got a separate handout or two on the website on these kinds of verbs, because some of these do not match the Korean verbs. I've realized, because students consistently make certain mistakes. One is the verb to mention. What is mention? What does that mean? To briefly speak or say something, but I see students use mention as if they really mean discuss. It does not mean discuss. It means to briefly mention something, like you briefly say something in a sentence, and then you move on to something else. It's not the same as discuss. And you don't say mention about, you just say mention. Likewise, you don't say discuss about, you just say discuss. Smith discussed the implications of this, not discuss about. What are some others? So many of these take that, and you need to know which of these verbs can take that. Some of these require a that, like suggested that. So for example, some of these do not take that. So you can say suggest that, I'm going to come back to this, but not support that. You can't say these results support that something. That doesn't work. You need to say supports the claim that, support the idea that. But this by itself doesn't work in English. Maybe it works in Korean, I guess, because I see Korean writers do this. But you can't say support that. You have to say support the idea that, the claim that, the fact that, the belief that, something. Which is entirely different. How about this? The judge, how about you could say suggested or ordered. Okay, either one of these. That the bail, something lowered, or that the defendant maybe, yeah, let's go with give. his passport because, you know, you don't want the criminal to get on a plane and fly to another country. So in Law and Order, for example, you see this sometimes. The judge will ask or order that the person, you know, give up his passport so he doesn't, you know, escape to another country. So what's the right verb form? The bail, what? This sounds kind of grammary, but this is more of a formal, I want to introduce a more formal academic style to you. What's the right verb form here? The bail what? Be lowered? Does that sound right to you? Some of my students, they thought it was funny, but this is true. You wouldn't say that the bail is lowered because it hasn't happened yet. So you could either say that the bail be lowered, or if you want to be a little more contemporary style, the bail should be lowered. That avoids this problem. But you could just say that the bail be lowered. Does this sound funny to you? Okay. How about this? The defendant give up his passport. Does that sound right to you all? You could also, if you want to be more contemporary, modern style, you could say should give up. But in a more formal style, the defendant give up. Not gives up, but give up. With verbs of ordering, suggesting, we're talking about something that hasn't happened yet, but in the context of somebody ordering, suggesting, recommending, whatever, we use this kind of verb form. And this is an old style verb form. If you want to know the linguistic term, this is subjunctive. Subjunctive mood, because if you talk about verbs referring to facts, that's indicative, like he gave up his passport, that's something factual. Something that's counterfactual or not happened yet, hypothetical, that's subjunctive. Now, you may know conditional verb forms like could, would, should. That's part of the Old English subjunctive. And this is another part of the Old English subjunctive, this kind of verb form with verbs of ordering and suggesting. It's subjunctive. It's contrary to fact. It hasn't happened yet. You're ordering somebody to do something. It's almost like an imperative. You're ordering or suggesting somebody to do something in the third person. If any of you are in literature, anybody in literature here? Anybody who reads plays? In play directions, like in Shakespeare plays, they'll say exit Romeo. The play directions, the playwriter says, exit Romeo, not Romeo exits, but exit Romeo, enter Romeo. And that's this kind of thing too. It's a third person kind of imperative or third person command. In other words, let or may Romeo enter or exit. Any Metallica fans? Famous heavy metal band. In the 1990s, they did a song called Enter Sandman. It's using this kind of language. It's kind of formal, but Sandman is kind of this mythical creature who sprinkles magic sand on you to help you fall asleep and have dreams. So this song is called Enter Sandman, and it's using this kind of literary language. So you'll see this sometimes in academic papers also. There are handouts on the website that detail these kinds of verbs of reporting and communication. Let me see. Another one is like it's kind of related. Blame and criticize. Koreans confuse these two verbs in English, blame and criticize. What's the difference? Because often Koreans will say, don't blame me. And no, I wasn't blaming you. What's the difference? Blame and criticize. So blaming is more like judging, saying that you're guilty. Criticize is simply pointing out something negative, a negative critique or evaluation. And in academic writing, you'd more likely say criticize. So-and-so criticized that theory, not blamed. That's different. Blaming is ascribing moral guilt or fault. Like it's your fault, you're guilty for that, which doesn't work in English. And I guess in Korean, maybe they're the same word, but those are different. Next Friday, we'll talk about other kinds of word choice errors, and I will have a booklet online on common word choice problems and a style guide too. Other things in part C, you can use this attributive adjective. That's an adjective before a noun. So for example, a standard counterbalance experimental design. So instead of just explaining in 1 or 2 sentences how they designed this experiment, there's probably usually there's some standard phrase for this kind of procedure, this kind of research method, whether it's something in humanities or in science or social science. Instead of giving a lengthy, wordy explanation, many times there's maybe a short, simple, standard expression in your field for describing this kind of thing. And so when possible, find a simple adjective noun phrase like a standard counterbalance experimental design. Instead of saying they divided subjects into 2 groups of 30 participants each and did this in one group and did that in another group, you don't need to do that. You can just say a standard counterbalance experimental design. Common phrase like that, that's easier. D is nominalizations, and this is a fun one. The Chinese characters might not have come out on your handout. I need to correct it. Something happened. If it didn't come out, it's these characters. So you see a lot of this in academic writing. For example, when you need to summarize or paraphrase somebody's ideas. So maybe originally you have, they applied connectionist modeling in order to analyze how the mind processes dreams. Turn this whole thing into a sentence that's kind of, it's got more prepositional phrases, so it's more complex in that sense. But in a sense, it's easier because you can make more complex sentences. So let's say you've got a subject, they, applied, a verb, and then an object. And this whole thing basically gets turned into maybe a subject, a noun phrase. This whole thing becomes itself the subject, their application of connectionist modeling to the analysis of dream process enabled them to do something. So this part here, they applied connectionist modeling to blah, blah, blah. This whole thing becomes a complex noun phrase. Their application of connectionist modeling enabled them to do such and such. And you'll see this a lot. A lot of times when they are using complex sentences in academic writing, they're doing this. Now sometimes you can overdo it and it becomes hard to read. So be careful not to overdo it. This is a common method in academic writing for summarizing, paraphrasing someone else's ideas. Or another example, the third example, the military invented the ARPANET, which allowed people to do blah, blah, blah. You change that to the military's invention of the ARPANET. That's a whole sentence right there. Revolutionized the dissemination of information. Okay. Now I'm not going to talk too much about that because I want to move on to number 3, transitionals. So this is one of my favorite things. Section 3, transitionals or connectives, transitional expressions. This is another important aspect of coherence. So one aspect is foregrounding and backgrounding. Another aspect is how you paraphrase information in your writing. A third aspect is whether you're expressing your own ideas or when you're paraphrasing someone else's ideas in your paper. You need to use transitional expressions. And so, but, or, thus, therefore, whence, wherefore, in contrast to the contrary, because, since, and such. On my website there's a whole handout like this of these kinds of expressions. You can print it out. It breaks it up into things that are like conjunctions for main clauses, for subordinate clauses, and other things. Print this out, put it on your wall, keep a copy in your restroom to read while you're in the restroom and such. Handy. It has stars on those that are kind of more informal expressions that are not really for academic writing. But I've done some study on how Korean writers use English transitionals, and I found some interesting things. So I want you to look at some of these. So hopefully your handout is the same as mine. I'm using an old version of my handout. I hope it's the same. But I've got 3.1 adverb placement. 3.2 complex sentence structure, we've done that. We can kind of, I'll talk through that. But 3.1 I want you to talk about. 3.3, 3.4. other topic transitionals. So do you have those? Well, if you have a handout, that is. So is it the same? You don't have next page? You don't have it? Okay. Okay, there's a problem with my handout. Okay. That's, so do you have it? You got counter-argumentation, active argumentation. Okay, types of rhetorical support. Okay. No, that's actually different from hers, though. Maybe, I think you've got the one for this afternoon. What's the title of this? That's for this afternoon. Okay. That's okay. Let me just read aloud some sentences for you from my handout. I think on the website it's actually a separate handout. I think I divided it into a separate handout. I think that's what I did. But there's a handout on the website of problems or errors that Koreans have with transitionals. Let me just read a few sentences for you. How does this sound as a sentence for academic writing? Especially, economic predictions are useful to make plans for long-term economic policy. Now, does that sound like a good academic sentence? Especially, economic predictions are useful, blah, blah, blah. In academic writing, in English, do we start a sentence usually with especially? Why not?
Especially is more stress.
It's what?
Particular point.
Okay.
So, usually some background information before especially.
Okay. How about in Korean? In Korean, can you start in formal and academic Korean, can you start a sentence with 특히, 특별히? Okay, but it's different in English. In English, it's too strong for academic writing. So, in English, if you start a sentence with especially, it's going to sound too informal. It's going to sound colloquial. Colloquial means kind of informal spoken style. Colloquial. Like that. Because usually, so especially is, it's an emphatic adverb. It emphasizes something. Now, at the beginning of a sentence, if I have an adverb at the beginning of the sentence, it's a sentence adverb, like hopefully, thankfully, fortunately we were able to get good results, something like that. It says something about your attitude toward the whole sentence, the interpretation of the whole sentence. But if you start the sentence with especially an emphatic adverb, it's like you're emphasizing the whole sentence. It's kind of like shouting at somebody. It's like typing email in all capital letters. It's kind of like that in English, in formal English. You might do this in informal writing, but in formal writing we don't really start a sentence like this as a sentence adverb because it's too strong, it breaks the flow. So what can you do instead? To avoid this kind of overly informal style.
Indeed.
Maybe indeed. Indeed is kind of like, it's a little different. I think I have a separate handout on the website on some of those particular markers, and indeed is kind of more for emphasizing a particular point, providing kind of clarification and more specific information. And it's a little strong. We don't use it indeed that often in academic writing. What's something else you can do? Put it right before a word, like within the sentence, before a verb or an adjective or an adverb. Like, for example, economic predictions are especially useful. Put it inside the sentence, that's one thing you can do. You can delete it altogether. Sometimes it might make sense without it. Or you could do something softer like particularly, in particular. That's not as strong. It's not like shouting. It doesn't have that kind of effect. The one time where it does work, it doesn't work if you're using it like a sentence adverb, like this. But if it's modifying, if you have an adjective phrase or an adverb phrase at the beginning of the sentence, then it would work. Like especially interesting was the finding that. So what we have here, this is an adjective phrase. So if you have an adjective phrase at the beginning, or an adverb phrase, something like that. But if it's like this, if it's a sentence adverb, that doesn't work in academic writing. So you can look at the website and look at some of the other handouts on these things for more explanation. This is okay because this is not really a sentence adverb. It's modifying interesting, and it's just that you've put interesting at the beginning, and you've put the subject over here. And this is something else that's in, I think, some of the extra handouts. So usually we have subject, verb, object, but here I put something else. I've got a verb, subject, and then maybe an object. So here I've moved the sentence order around, and this is a special thing we also do sometimes in academic writing. This is another kind of transitional device. So instead of saying the finding that blah 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 was especially interesting, I've moved interesting to the front of the sentence. The subject is after the verb, and this is called inversion. And it's discussed also in some of the handouts on the website. This is also a transitional device too. It's for moving to a related idea. So you're talking about maybe some other findings in a study. You're talking about somebody's study and some of their different findings, and you highlight one of them by saying especially interesting in their study was their finding that blah blah blah, or the fact that blah blah blah. This is a transitional device, this kind of grammar structure. I have seen, when I was an ESL teacher, I saw old TOEFL tests, the kind like paper and pencil TOEFL tests, where they had questions about this kind of grammar structure. The first part was blanked out, and you had to choose the right grammar form of an inverted sentence, but they gave no context. And this is one reason I got mad at the TOEFL tests that I saw. A lot of their, at least the old style TOEFL tests, or the paper version of the TOEFL test, they have a lot of grammar questions like this. They give you no context, one sentence, and pick the right form of the sentence. It may be an inverted sentence form, maybe it's a tense, like perfect tense, maybe it's articles like a and the. But these things depend on context. This works in a context when you are moving to you're making a transition to a related point. Something new but related, and you're highlighting it. It's used in academic writing. It's also used in narrative writing and literature, like in the corner stood a angry farmer with an axe, you know, kind of literature or narratives or stories. These things work in context, and I hated the TOEFL test because it's so mechanical. It takes these things out of context. These things, tenses, inversion, definite, indefinite articles, they work only in context. They're contextual. This in particular because it's a transitional device. And that's one reason I don't like TOEFL tests, because they ask these kind of stupid questions. Or the way that in your past they just drilled English rules into your head. They made you memorize rules. It doesn't work. These grammar structures have meaning. Particularly meaning in context. Inversion has a particular meaning or function in context. Articles like A and the. Next Friday morning, I'm going to talk about articles and the secrets of articles and how they work. I'm going to give you information that's not in your grammar books. It's not in your textbooks. I'll give you some information from some of my own work on articles, how they work in context. Because it's different from what you've been taught. They've taught you lies about grammar, I'm afraid. And so I'm going to clear that up. in my research on Korean's use of transitionals, conjunctions, I have seen them in academic writing. One, do this. They'll put a comma after but in academic writing. We don't really do this. Or a comma after so or then. This is colloquial style. In English, we don't usually put commas after so or then. There's some other comma rules. There's some other handouts on my website for comma rules with conjunctions you can look at. But there's no comma after so. There's no comma usually after then. Or after but. And the reason I think they're putting a comma after but sometimes is this. In conversation, okay, there are two kinds of buts. There's like, but I don't know, normal intonation. Or in conversation, but I don't really know. And that's more emphatic. And the comma represents that kind of intonation that we have with a stronger contrast. But in formal writing, this isn't really formal style. This is very colloquial style. For a stronger contrast, if you want a stronger contrast, what do you do? Okay, maybe otherwise. What else? On the other hand, okay, what else? In contrast. Or also, however. So, however connects two main clauses, and you need either a full stop before, blah, 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 period, however, comma, or blah, 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 semicolon, however, comma. So for a stronger contrast, you can use however. Now, however kind of foregrounds both clauses equally. Now, if you don't want to do that, if you want a milder contrast, to avoid using but, what's a milder contrast? Backgrounding. How do you background something? A contrast but with backgrounding. Subordinate clause. Okay, maybe in spite of. Use a prepositional phrase. That's something you can do. What else? Whereas is kind of I feel like it's a stronger contrast. Kind of like, it works kind of like however, whereas but maybe it's a bit stronger. For something that's not quite as strong, you want a background, and it's too complex for a prepositional phrase like despite. You need a whole clause, a whole sentence. Okay, while or sometimes while or although or though. These two are actually almost the same. Maybe although originally was a little stronger than though, because it was a compound of all plus though. So while, though, although, they kind of background things more. Now what I have found in my study, in my research, though, that Koreans at different levels, from undergraduate to graduate students, they use too many buts in their paper. It's always but, and they don't use a variety of other contrast markers. They use however less often. They use while. Especially the undergraduates, they almost never used while. I think maybe they're confused between while as a time clause marker, a time adverb marker, or temporal clause, and while as a contrast, a mild contrast. Because there's a mild contrast, becomes while something is going on, this is also going on. And so the idea of a contrast, a mild contrast or comparison comes from that idea. And it seems like they also don't use although or though as much. So what I find, even graduate students, we're using but a little more often than they should. And it's not wrong to use but. Even in academic writing, writers might start a sentence with but not as often. More often, academic writers are going to use a variety. They're going to use but, however, although, while, yet, in contrast, to the contrary. On the other hand, use more of a variety. What I found was the Korean students didn't use much variety. They were always using but. Now, if you're trying to write an academic paper, you're trying to sound smart, you're trying to set a serious academic tone, this really kind of hurts your tone. It makes your paper sound too colloquial or too informal, and so it's not as convincing. Sometimes I find them using redundant markers, like although blah 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 still, or although blah 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 but in one sentence. Too many contrast markers. It's like one per sentence, things like that. I've also seen Korean writers use topic transition markers too much. These are for changing the topic, either for coming to a new topic or coming to a related topic, or for returning to a previous topic. And so I've seen them use a lot of in case of, in my case, in case of Korea. That sounds very Korean, right? That actually is from Korean. 경유에는, right? That doesn't translate into English, especially academic English. It sounds very, very colloquial. And we don't really use in case of. So instead of saying in case of Korea, to say, you know, in the Korean context, in the Korean example, or instead of saying in the case of daylight it is composed of, to say daylight is composed of. Many times you can just get rid of it altogether. In fact, in case of sounds more like a conditional, like in case of fire, meaning if there's a fire, call, you know, 119 in Korea or 911 in America. So, other kinds of topic transitionals are things that are not necessarily bad, but are also overused. We do use these sometimes in academic writing, but things like as regards, regarding, as for. We do use these sometimes in academic writing, but I found the Koreans were using them too much. Why? I'm not sure. Maybe in Korean it's normal to use these kinds of expressions. In academic English, if you use these too much, it's also going to sound colloquial. These are often used for shifting to a related topic or returning to a previous topic. As for the target group, blah, 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 or as regards the target group, many times we can get rid of these and maybe say the target group exhibited. Like instead of saying as regards the target group, we found that, blah, 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 to say in the target group or for the target group, we found that, or the target group showed more something, which you can make it the subject of a sentence sometimes. So sometimes you can avoid these. It's okay to use them occasionally, but I found that Korean writers overuse these kinds of topic shift markers. A stronger kind of topic shift marker is there is or there are. So I found Koreans use these too much in their academic writing. So why do Koreans use there is and there are too much? Well, you're translating something from Korean, right? What is it? 있다. And that's a very common verb in Korean, but it doesn't have an exact equivalent in English. In English, it corresponds to there is, there are, have, be, exist, and other things. It's not an exact equivalent. We don't use this as much in academic writing. So using too much of this, again, will sound colloquial. It's okay to use it a lot in informal writing, but not as much in academic writing. In English, it's more for a new topic shift, shifting to a new topic. So a famous example from linguistics writing, let's say you're in an American house and you look out your kitchen window and you see in your garden a unicorn, and you exclaim, "Hey, there's a unicorn in my garden." This is an example from a famous linguist. You're pointing out something new. Like, oh, something really new. There's a unicorn in my garden. Or I need to stop drinking so much or something. In academic writing, this would be for introducing something new to your discussion, introducing a new topic. Sometimes instead, though, we might use a new paragraph for a new topic, or you might just start a sentence with that subject. Like, a unicorn is standing in my garden. There's a sentence you use every day, and such. Or sometimes, instead of there is, you can use another intransitive verb, a 타동사, like there stood in my garden a unicorn. There arose a clamor in the living room. There appeared. There stood. So sometimes for kind of shifting to a new topic, that's a bit smoother. If you use another, certain intransitive verbs that indicate a state or condition, there exists, there tends to be, there happen to be, or intransitive 타동사 verbs of change of state. There arose, there appeared, there was found, or something like that. Some other kinds of colloquial sounding expressions I've seen in Koreans writing are things like starting a sentence with besides. This is colloquial. What's better for academic writing, formal writing? In addition to, furthermore, perhaps moreover. We don't use moreover as much though in modern English though. So don't overdo moreover, it'll sound too formal. Occasionally, once in a paper. Whether or not. This is colloquial, we just say whether. You know, we've wanted to show whether or not such and such was the case, just whether. Another thing is overuse of things like etc., especially so when you have lists of items, I see Koreans overusing things like etc. and so on, especially if you start it with like e.g. or for example, it's really redundant. It's really redundant. So avoid things like that. There are some other handouts on the website on some of these transitionals. There are some other things. Sentence adverbs. I kind of mentioned sentence adverbs before. Sometimes you can use those, especially when you need to put a lot of adverbs into a sentence. You can put one at the beginning, like thankfully we found, fortunately we found that, unfortunately, doubtfully, regrettably, surprisingly, theoretically. Also, something similar, what I call topic adverbs, things like psychologically, starting a sentence with psychologically, economically, linguistically, sociologically, biologically, evolutionarily, neurologically, etc., and such. Okay, what else? Something else which is not on the handout, I'm not going to, there's more stuff in the handouts and the online materials you can read on your own. I don't want to bore you with all the details. Something else I've noticed, especially with undergraduate writing, is and this may be true of new writers in general, I think, but I find a lack of coherence because they kind of move from one topic to another. It's like every sentence or every other sentence is moving to another topic. In academic writing, we usually have pretty sustained, detailed discussion of one topic throughout. So if you think about the subject of the sentence, what the sentence is about is a topic. We'll write it T. And then maybe in the predicate is kind of what we call a focus. which is kind of the new information. So, for example, I saw a unicorn in my garden, where I is the topic, it's the subject, it's what the sentence is about. And the new information is in the predicate, the verb, and what comes after the verb, like saw a unicorn in my garden. The object, like unicorn, that's kind of the main focus. It's the new item, and it's kind of what your mind will focus on when you interpret or read or hear a sentence. Your brain will kind of spend a little more time on whatever the new stuff is at the end of a sentence. That's the focus. So most often, if you kind of diagram the flow of topics in a paragraph, in academic writing, let's say you have topic 1, and the next sentence will continue topic 1, and such. It'll be kind of a smooth flow for a while. And there's not much really abrupt topic shift, except maybe sometimes this focus will become a second topic. Maybe you'll shift to something related in a sentence, and this might be sustained for a while and such. And your paragraph might end like this, or maybe your original topic might come back later in the paragraph. But what I have noticed, especially with newer students, like my undergraduate students, is they go like topic 1, and then topic 2, and then topic 3. They do a lot of topic shifting. So they're not really doing sustained discussion of a single topic. And even this topic 2 is related because it's a comment on this topic and such. So they'll jump around. They'll discuss something very superficially. They'll discuss one idea for one or two sentences, and they jump to something else, and they jump to something else. And so their writing loses coherence because they're not engaging in sustained, detailed discussion of one topic, of one paragraph topic. And that leads to a lack of coherence. So this kind of topic flow is something that new writers have difficulty with. And so their writing sounds maybe like, although if they're a soft junior or senior, but their writing sounds more like an American college freshman student or a high school student because it's jumping around too much. And so they kind of lack the sophistication of doing in-depth discussion and analysis and critique. It's kind of a superficial discussion, partly because of this constant jumping from one topic to a new topic, and sometimes an abrupt shift to a completely new topic, which really should be a separate paragraph, because it's not from like a focus here, but it's some completely new topic from outside that comes from out of nowhere, comes out of the blue. And so some of the things in coherence, that make for coherence that we've talked about are, again, things like foregrounding and backgrounding in your sentence structure, use of longer sentences, use of subordinate clauses, use of those other grammatical structures that are mentioned in the handout for smooth coherence and flow and development of ideas. Two, the way you paraphrase or summarize information, the way you really squeeze it down to a concise summary. The purpose of any kind of paraphrase or summary is mainly to support your ideas. And we'll talk about this again, I think, next Friday afternoon, and using sources. It's not just to report what somebody else did, like a news report. You're commenting on their ideas, their scholarly ideas, or their research ideas in order to make a point. It's about whatever point you're making. It's not just rattling off, so Smith did this, Jones did this, Cruttenden did that, and Dickerson did that. You're reporting what they did in order to make a case for your research, either the need for your ideas, a rationale for your ideas or your research, or to prove a point, or to critique them and say, they claim this, but I don't agree. And this is why, 1, 2, 3. So you're making your own point. It's not just reporting in a dry way, blah, blah, blah. A third thing is the transitionals that you use, the transitional expressions in their guides. One thing I forgot to mention, also Korean writers overuse this first, second, third. That's one thing I forgot to mention. First, blah, 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 second, blah, 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 third, blah, blah, blah. You learned that from your TOEFL writing prep courses, your TOEFL writing. Fine for TOEFL writing, not so much in academic writing. In academic writing, it sounds kind of mechanical or formulaic. It sounds like you're writing a TOEFL essay. We don't really use it unless you really have some complex or abstract ideas where you really need to make clear to the reader the sequence. But otherwise, we often just leave those out and start with a subject. Unless it's something really complicated and hard for the reader to really follow. Also, first of all, that's colloquial. We don't really use first of all. And I see students confused about first, second, third, and firstly, secondly, thirdly. Do you know the difference? First, second, third, that's North American. Firstly, secondly, thirdly is British. So don't confuse your American and British. Pick one and be consistent. Use consistent American or consistent British. So coherence, the flow of ideas. Again, it comes from the use of foregrounding and backgrounding, the grammar structure of your sentences, to the kinds of transition devices that you use. 3, the way you summarize ideas and such. And 4, a smooth topic flow, detailed, sustained discussion of one topic before you move on to something else, not just jumping from one idea to another. Okay, so that's coherence, that's the flow of ideas. Next Friday morning I'll talk about cohesion, which is the word flow of words, and also word choice, including common Konglish errors with English wording. That's next Friday. And this afternoon I'll talk about general considerations for writing academic papers and getting published, especially if you want an academic career. Okay, so that's it for today. So thank you for coming out in the cold weather. And this afternoon, room 306. If you're coming at 2 o'clock. Sorry, we're moving around from room to room because we lost our original room. Someone took it over. Right. So hope to see you this afternoon.